Why don't we begin by discussing what today is the conventional account of how slavery was resisted and abolished in the 19th century?
Well, for a long time, and I think this continues up to this day, certainly when it comes to the sort of commonly understood account, this is a story that has been mainly told through the lens of Western abolitionists. So this was a movement that started in the later 18th century and in places like Britain, France, a little bit later in the United States. And the conventional wisdom was that it was these enlightened liberal figures, people like William Wilberforce in Britain, Victor Schœlcher in France, Abraham Lincoln in the United States. They were seen as mainly the driving force behind the idea that slavery should be abolished. And the conventional wisdom was that the enslaved themselves played a very minor role, if any role at all, in the process of emancipation. The one exception, of course, was the Haitian Revolution. This was the former French colony of Saint-Domingue, where the enslaved fought off Napoleon Bonaparte's troops who had come to enslave them, and they were able to overthrow the slavers and create the world's first independent post-colonial state, the nation of Haiti, which was born in 1804. But Haiti is generally seen as an exception, and everywhere else, this was the story as it was told of abolition was a story that was thought to be driven by these enlightened reformers and by Western Enlightenment ideas. And so what I tried to do in this book was to actually test that proposition and try and find out what role the abolitionists in Africa and in the Caribbean played.
And what did you find out? I mean, did you discover that actually Haiti was more the rule than the exception? I mean, what's the story that you found to be true?
Well, the story that I found, and it did surprise me because I hadn't really expected to find out so much in terms of what was different. The basic headline that I found was that the enslaved themselves resisted enslavement from the moment that Atlantic slavery began. You know, one of the things you see when you look at I have a timeline at the end of my book, and you have a Spanish colonial governor already complaining that his slaves are escaping in 1503, right? So this is barely when Atlantic slavery has started. I found a massive uprising on the island of Sao Tome in 1595. So long before people had any consciousness even that Atlantic slavery was a general widespread phenomenon, you had enslaved people resisting and fighting back in many different ways. And so in the early parts of the book, what I try and do is to show how all the features of resistance that we generally know about in the 18th and 19th centuries actually have long histories in Africa and in the early centuries of Atlantic slavery.
Those examples you cite are very, very old, and they're sort of well before the Enlightenment, which many have argued is where slaves picked up their ideas of freedom. But you're saying that's not true. They had their own definitions and desires for freedom.
Yes, and my first chapter is really set in Africa, because I think Africa obviously is where all these captives were taken and forcibly transplanted onto the New World. And I thought if one really wants to understand where these ideas of resistance come from, one needs to look more closely at Africa. And what I found is that every feature of resistance that we commonly associate with slave revolts in the Caribbean and in the Americas was, as it were, trialed already in Africa itself. You know, the enslaved revolt, they form free settlements in Africa, they develop ideas against slavery. I mean, I discovered, and this is the scholarship of a colleague in Bristol, that already in the 17th century, an African prince lodges a petition against slavery in the Vatican. So you had abolitionists already who were not just thinking that slavery is a bad thing, as it were, as individuals. They were thinking philosophically about how slavery was, and this was what this petition lodged in the Vatican was about, how slavery was contrary to God's law. So there's a whole backdrop to abolitionism, which actually is rooted in African ideas, African values, and also African military practices. Because one of the things that emerges in the book is that guerrilla warfare, which we commonly associate with resistance to Napoleonic, the Napoleonic Wars in Spain in the early 19th century, that guerrilla warfare is something that is actually practiced by the Africans and introduced in the Caribbean and in the Americas from the moment that Atlantic slavery is established.
And when this complaint was lodged in the Vatican, arguing that slavery contravened God's law, what's the God being talked about here? Is this a Christian? Is this a Christian argument, or is this something more indigenous to African spiritual traditions? I'm curious.
That's a very important question. And one of the things I discovered is that, in a sense, there were many different forms, there were many different types of spiritual arguments against slavery that were formed in Africa. One is actually a Christian argument, because in some parts of pre-colonial Africa, Christianity was quite widespread. For example, in the Congo,
Christianity was already there.
Christianity was already there in pre-colonial Africa, exactly. And so this particular argument, which is put forward by an African prince called Lorenzo da Silva Mendonça, he's a Christian. And so he's operating within the conventions, the canons, the traditions of Christianity. And he's using Christian arguments, basically natural law arguments, to say that slavery is contrary to God's law. But he also argues that it's contrary to human law as well.
Couldn't some argue that is a European influence there, this idea of natural law? I mean, have many argued that?
Well, actually, for one thing, very few people have looked at that African tradition. It's only very recently that it's been uncovered. But the other thing that I found was that when you look at resistance practices in Africa, some of them are inspired by these Christian traditions. But actually, I'd say probably the majority, and this is something I explore in my in a separate chapter, the majority of these traditions, when you look at their spiritual ramifications, they come from African natural religions, what I call Obia, which is basically a sort of an umbrella term which designates a whole raft of ways of understanding oneself and one's relationship with the world, which includes divination, the belief in natural spirits, the belief in reincarnation. And one of the things that starts to happen when you have slavery developing in Africa is that these natural religions are invoked as a way of resisting them. So resistance to slavery comes in part from Christianity, but it also comes in part, in its spiritual dimensions, from these African natural religions, and also from Islam as well. There's an Islamic strand, which is also very significant. And indeed, one of the things I'm able to trace is the influence of these Islamic ideas, which come from Africa, on later anti-slavery revolts, notably in places like Brazil.
That's fascinating. And you say at one point in your book that Western historians have long maintained that pre-colonial Africans had no modern conception of freedom. And I suppose you're referring to a modern conception of freedom there. How similar are the conceptions of freedom that we've just talked about to the modern conception of freedom?
Well, I suppose in order to answer that properly, one has to have some sense of what the modern conception of freedom is, and there's quite a lot of discussion around that. What I'm trying to say in the book is that if we think of modern Western freedom as centering around the notion of individual rights, that is one way of thinking about freedom. But actually, there is another. I mean, it is there in the West, but it's there elsewhere in other parts of the world too. Another way of thinking about freedom, which is much more collective, which is much more centered around the idea of what I call autonomy. In other words, it's an idea of freedom in which you're preventing other people from doing bad things to you, right? So it's not about what rights you possess as an individual. It's whether you can be allowed to flourish without oppressive institutions or groups trying to force you to be somebody that you don't want to be. And it's that idea of freedom which is actually very deeply rooted in Africa, because a lot of decentralized political communities in Africa are already operating with that notion of freedom. If you like, it's a communal idea of freedom. A lot of the villages from where people were snatched and then enslaved actually had no, not only did they not have any conception of slavery, they weren't necessarily run in a kind of hierarchical way. So they had a sort of instinctive understanding of what it meant to be free, and slavery very fundamentally challenges that. And what is interesting is that when these people are then transplanted into the New World, they then revive these ideas of freedom as autonomy. And I think that that theme of freedom as autonomy is one that runs through all the major revolts that I have charted in the book, including the Haitian Revolution. The fundamental idea of freedom that comes through the Haitian Revolution is not a sort of Western liberal idea. And I wrote about this in my previous book on Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint Louverture's idea of freedom is to be autonomous from the French. So you see that idea put into place, put into practice in the most successful slave revolution that we have had, namely the Haitian one. But you see it everywhere else.
So these these pivotal rebellions and revolts were inspired by ideas of freedom that you say are rooted in Africa. At what point does that change? At what point does the afterlife of these ideas sort of start to dissipate and become replaced perhaps by more Eurocentric ideas of freedom?
Well, it's a constant process. It's a constant flux. And I think one of the things I also want to try and do, that's why the structure of the book is both thematic and chronological. What I try and do in the book is show that, first of all, people were resisting from the outset, in other words, from the 1500s and 1600s. But once people start to get to the New World, they start to think in terms of the realities that they face there. They are exposed to some other ideas. They're exposed to each other's ideas too. And once you have traditions of resistance that start to develop in the Caribbean and in the Americas, the ideas that emerge out of those forms of resistance also feed into their practices. Like, for example, with Haiti, one of the things I discovered was that there were traditions of resistance in Haiti already in the 1500s. I mean, it wasn't yet called Haiti, but in the 1500s and 1600s and 1700s, people are already resisting. And those traditions are also traditions that irrigate, if you like, and shape the thinking of the Haitian revolutionaries in the later 18th and early 19th century. So by the time you get to the late 18th and early 19th century, sure, there are Western ideas that are shaping the way people are thinking, but those ideas are blending with ideas that come from Africa, as well as ideas that have come from the Caribbean and other parts of the Americas. And indeed, once you have the Haitian Revolution in 1804, and I have a whole chapter on that, well, indeed, several chapters after that, what you see happening is that the Haitian Revolution itself becomes an inspiration for slaves in other parts of the Atlantic, and it becomes almost like their lodestar, something that they imagine as a source of their emancipation.
And would it be your contention, really, that we all essentially want to be free? Would you go as far as saying that?
I think freedom is something natural. It's something that I noticed with some irony, that actually many colonial governors who were in charge of maintaining order in these territories with enslaved people, I noticed that they said that themselves. And indeed, I use that as one of the titles of one of my chapter. I think it's a colonial governor in Brazil who's writing sometime in the 17th century. And he says that the desire for human freedom is the most natural desire of the human heart. So this is him, right? He's trying to contain these slaves that he's got under him. And he realizes that in a fundamental sense, they aspire to freedom, and that freedom is something that can't be contained.
Let me ask you, Sudhir, about your own life. I mean, how did you get interested in slavery? You are from a community in Mauritius that is, in its own way, connected to the history of slavery. Is that right?
That's right. Mauritius, Mauritius had first had slaves brought to the island by the Dutch in the 17th century, then by the French, then by the British. So roughly a quarter of the population of Mauritius today are descendants of African slaves. Mostly African, although there were some slaves who actually also came from the Indian subcontinent. So this is a story that I grew up around. When I was at school in Mauritius, it wasn't really talked about very much or taught at school. We still lived, the narrative that we had about slavery was one which had been slightly erased for various complicated reasons, which I won't get into now. But basically, the story of slavery, and particularly slave resistance, is one that has emerged fairly late in places like Mauritius. And I think one of the main reasons for that is to do with the reason why I wanted to write this book, is that even in former societies where there had been slavery, the story of resistance is one that has been slightly put aside or buried because people wanted to emphasize more collective values, wanted to emphasize more positive aspects of the history of the island or the colony. So I'd say that it's in the past maybe 2 or 3 decades that people are now taking this history more seriously.
Do you feel some profound sense of kinship, perhaps, with the enslaved peoples? I mean, after Britain abolishes slavery, islands like Mauritius start to import indentured labourers, which some would say was a form of slavery, but it just wasn't called that. And indentured labourers were brought over from India and Southeast Asia and the likes. And was your family among those who came with the transportation of indentured labourers?
Absolutely. My grandfather, my father's father, that's right, was brought to Mauritius as an indentured labourer in the late 19th century. And as you say, the methods, the techniques of maintaining order and discipline in the plantations. I mean, these were the same sugar plantations which had been worked on by enslaved people, and indentured laborers were expected to work on the same fields. And the methods of discipline, order maintenance were not fundamentally dissimilar, certainly in the 19th and early 20th century. And I think one of the things that is very striking when you look at the history across time is how indentured laborers from India, their struggle for greater freedom and greater rights is a struggle that actually mirrored, to a very large extent, the struggles of the enslaved people from Africa. So it's the same struggle. And you see that elsewhere too, when you look at the history of the fight against colonialism, say in Jamaica. You see that black abolitionists and their descendants actually continue a struggle which is more or less essentially the same struggle. And indeed, in places like Jamaica, you have big revolts that take place. For example, the Morant Bay Revolt in Jamaica happens in 1865, so long after abolition. But it happens because the black slaves, the former enslaved people, realize that they have no rights, that even those rights that were nominally given to them after the abolition of slavery were not, they weren't able to exercise properly. So the form that struggle takes is one that continues over time.
How do you rate contemporary Britain's understanding of its own history of slavery?
I think there's been some important progress. This is something that is now talked about, that historians study, and for a long time the focus had been almost exclusively on the white abolitionist elite, and we now have, thanks to the work of a number of very distinguished scholars, a much more sort of fine-grained appreciation of the role, particularly of resistance movements in places like Jamaica, Barbados, Demerara, and then Jamaica again in the early 1830s. So there's an understanding now that emancipation happened not just because the British government and a few white liberal leaders wanted it, but it happened because there was this big push on the ground from the enslaved themselves. What's missing, though, still, is first of all a sort of embrace of this story by the British authorities themselves. I mean, Britain is very singular, as you know, in that, unlike France or unlike the United States, the abolition of slavery is not officially commemorated. Right? There isn't one day, like there is in France. On May the 10th in France, that's the abolition of slavery day. In the United States, Juneteenth has now become a federal holiday, although Trump is trying to do his best to not mark it very much. But public authorities in Britain have continued to be rather reluctant to talk about this issue. And certainly when it comes to public space, although we've started to have some interesting statues and public monuments, and Sadiq Khan has just commissioned a monument which will come up, I think, this year or next year in the Docklands. There still is a reluctance, I'd say, publicly to commemorate and mark, particularly black resistance, and that's something that I feel still needs to be worked on.
Yeah, because on the other hand, some might say there's almost a zeal to talk about it, but in a particular way. That is to say, teaching Britons to be proud of the role we played in abolishing the slave trade and that kind of discourse. I mean, do you think we should be proud of that?
Well, I think anybody who fought against as oppressive and horrible an institution as slavery, I think the British should be proud of. You know, I am critical of Wilberforce and the abolitionist leaders, but I'm critical of them because I think they followed the wrong strategy. I think they delayed for too long. People were already calling for immediate abolition in the late 18th century. And because of people like Wilberforce, that call was not heeded until the enslaved themselves on the ground made the moves that they did in Barbados, in Demerara, and then in Jamaica. However, that's not to say that these people were not, morally admirable people. They were. What I'm trying to do in the book is to say that people like Wilberforce don't really constitute the entire story. Right? That if you really want to think about why abolition happened in Britain, you need to look beyond those people to the people who were on the ground and were the driving forces behind change. And those were, if you like, two groups. It was the rank and file of the abolitionist movement in Britain, and I write about them in the book. And it was a mass movement. And there were a lot of women involved, a lot of young people involved. There were also sailors, dock workers. It was a sort of popular protest movement from the late 18th century onwards, and they were the ones who were pushing for immediate abolition and not being heard by their leadership. So that's one group, and I think certainly British people should be proud of them because they pushed for change very markedly. But the second group, and they're the ones who I think, when you look at the whole picture, they were the ones who were the most important players in this, were the enslaved themselves on the ground. They're the ones who are campaigning, they're the ones who are mobilizing, and they're the ones who I think their lives need to be rediscovered and celebrated. I think it would be wonderful if we could have, how many people in Britain have heard the name Sharp, who was the leader of the Jamaican rebellion in the early 1830s. I think he deserves to have a monument somewhere in central London because he played just as important a role in ending slavery in Britain as did the other figures whose names are better known.
I mean, building monuments is one way of acknowledging this history. Another way of acknowledging it is reparations. I mean, what do you think about the debate around reparations? I mean, should Britain or other powers, other countries, be paying reparations for slavery?
Well, I think it's certainly something that should be part of a sensible public conversation. And I think one of the problems at the moment is that the conversation around reparations has become a bit ideological, and you're either pushing it in order to pursue a particular political agenda, or you're resisting it because you're opposed to that political agenda. And I think one of the first things one needs to do when thinking about reparations is to think about the wider context in which that conversation is taking place. So one of the things that is very clear is that governments in the West have offered reparations for historical injustices. Right? They've done it. Jewish people were compensated for what happened in the Holocaust. Japanese Americans were compensated when they were interned during the Second World War. Germany has compensated the Namibian government for what Germany, not the current German state, but
its predecessors.
The predecessor German state did to the Herero and Nama peoples in the early 20th century. So reparations are things that governments do under certain conditions, right? So it's not a question of saying this is something that would be unique to Britain. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think the conversation about reparations sometimes gets focused almost exclusively on financial aspects. And this goes back to what you were saying a moment ago, Tanjil. I think the debate about reparations should also be a debate about common understanding. I think one of the most important things about this conversation is that there should be a mutual recognition and awareness of what the past was really about. And I think that if that were to happen, that could perhaps create the conditions for a sensible conversation to be had about reparations. But one thing is clear: the governments in the countries where slavery used to exist, whether it's Africa or the Caribbean, are very clear that reparations are owed to them. And this was a demand that was first adopted by the CARICOM countries in 2013, I think, and now it's been adopted by the Organization of African Unity since 2023. But I think the first step would be for the British government to acknowledge that a historic injustice has been committed. And there are governments in Europe that have made that step already. The Dutch government have done so. One of the interesting things that's also happening in that context is that you have institutions in Britain who have already pledged reparations. The Guardian, Glasgow University, Lloyd's, the insurer, the Church of England. All of these institutions have looked at their own past and recognized that they have reparations to make. So if institutions like those are able to think about their own past and offer compensation, I think there is certainly a scope for the British government to think about its own role.
We've been talking a lot about the past, but I want to ask you about the future. I mean, at the start of your book, you quote Aimé Césaire, who says, "Freedom does not fall from the sky, and it is never completely granted, but taken and conquered." I want to ask you, what are the lessons that today's oppressed can draw from the stories of resistance that you capture in your book?
Thank you, because I really want this book to be a book that is, very much about the past, but also that helps us navigate our way through the difficult period that we're living through at the moment. I think the resistance of the enslaved have some very important messages to give us. One is not to despair. These are people who faced unimaginable oppression, sometimes for centuries. But one of the things that my book shows is that they never gave up. Their fundamental belief in the principles that they adhered to was one that continued to unite them. So that's one lesson that I think is very important. The other one is unity. I think one of the things that you find when you look at these different revolts and different ways in which the enslaved fought back against their oppressors is that they came together and, where necessary, ignored the sort of cultural, religious, political divisions that may have divided them and which their oppressors tried to impose upon them. Unity is something that was really important to them, and the great writers, who produced slave narratives like Frederick Douglass, they emphasize the importance of unity. And the third and final thing is that one of the things that I think the enslaved themselves teach us is that you can't take freedom for granted. Freedom is something very fragile. You can have it at one moment, and it can be taken away from you very quickly. And I think people, particularly in the United States now, are finding this, and therefore the need to be determined, to be focused, and to be resilient, and not to take anything for granted, is something that these enslaved resistors have taught us.